Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 7 of the regular season here for the Sharks as they take on the Colorado Avalanche and end up dropping it 7-3. And this game actually started off pretty well for the Sharks. Through the first, I would say, 10-15 minutes of this one, the Sharks were doing a pretty decent job at quelling the Colorado Avalanche offense. It was quite obvious from the get-go that the Avalanche were an extremely skilled and speedy team, which is something we obviously knew coming into this game, but the Sharks were doing a good job at stifling that. Then it would be the Sharks scoring the first goal of the game from Ryan Donato, and a 1-0 lead was looking pretty decent until the Avalanche would rattle off three quick ones unanswered late in that first period, and the game would begin to get away from the San Jose Sharks. Those would be goals from former San Jose Shark Joonas Donskoi, then Saad, as well as Mikko Rantanen. Coming into the second period, it would not stop there for the Avalanche. They'd get another 2 goals, Nichushkin shorthanded, and then finally Sam Girard, and that would end the night from goaltender Martin Jones. The Sharks would then get one more goal, Noah Gregor, to potentially start a comeback, I guess, but the Avalanche would say no to that rather quickly, and goals from Taves, this time onto Dubnyk, of course, as well as a goal from Saad would make it 7-2 and basically put the game completely out of reach for the Sharks. Eventually, in the third period, Logan Couture would get one for them to make the score look a slightly more respectable, but in the end, you drop it 7-3. It doesn't look all that great, and as I had said, this was going to be the biggest test for the Sharks thus far this season, and they did not necessarily pass. You could say they definitely failed this one. But we'll see if, going into the following game, also against the Colorado Avalanche, if, like in the previous 3 times they've done this year, they can split this little 2-game series. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, and of course would be Devan Dubnyk. Jones ended up getting the start in this one after a couple of respectable outings against the at least the previous respectable outing against the Minnesota Wild, and it did not go all that great for Jones. Now, I'm not going to say that this was entirely his fault, as it was also the case that the Sharks' defense really didn't do him many favors. You look at this Donskoi one, that's a tip. The Brandon Saad one was just a complete lack of coverage. Saad had time to make himself a sandwich and a drink before trying to take this shot, and he ends up scoring it, of course. The Nichushkin shorthanded goal was a bit of an unfortunate bounce. The Rantanen one was a cross-ice pass that, again, a couple of players find themselves puck-watching, moving towards Nathan MacKinnon. He just outplays them completely by getting this cross-ice pass through. So, in general, it wasn't completely Jones's fault, but 5 goals let in through the first half of the game is never really going to be a good look. Dubnyk stepped in and was not necessarily much better. He let in this goal from Devin Taves, found himself completely out of position, due sort of to his own fault, actually, then lets in another one to Brandon Saad. There wasn't much action after that, so he only lets in 2 goals, but the Avalanche weren't really pushing as hard as they had been earlier on in the game, so hard to necessarily give Devan Dubnyk so much credit in that area. When it comes to the following game, who is going to start for the San Jose Sharks, I guess I'm leaning a bit more towards Dubnyk is my idea, but it's definitely possible Jones finds his way back in between the pipes if Booner wants to go down that route. Next, I'll be talking about the first line, and the reason I'm talking about the entirety of the first line because it was the only line that was even relatively good in this game. The second line was a complete unmitigated disaster of Hertl, Kane, and Leonard. The third line was, I guess, half decent, but still not very good with Gregor, Gambrell. Especially defensively, this line didn't look that great. Gregor, Gambrell, and Meyer, and then the fourth line was more or less invisible. But the first line was pretty impressive, I would say. Couture, LeBanc, and Donato. Donato continues to quickly become one of my favorite San Jose Sharks player, at least for the current season. Who knows if Donato will stick around? I do hope he does, but it's definitely possible he ends up going somewhere else. But Donato really working hard every single shift, as I've mentioned in the past. Logan Couture also looking pretty good here in these past couple of games. And LeBanc, a player who I had called out a few games ago as not really looking all that great, and maybe not even earning himself a decent spot in the top 6, has gotten a lot better in these past couple of games, and I really liked LeBanc's effort offensively at the very least. Obviously, the defensive game is still sort of coming along, I guess you could say, for Kevin LeBanc, but the offensive game, there were a couple of very nice chances, especially early on in the game and later on in the game. So, like the early parts of the first period and then the late parts of the third period. But just in general, the only really good line for the San Jose Sharks, which I guess, is obviously a bad thing, but if they can continue that, it could be a good thing moving forward for the Sharks that this line is clicking and is finding some good chemistry. And finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about here, as otherwise I'd be saying way too much negative, but this is something that I do need to bring up at this point, is John Leonard. So of course, Leonard, the rookie who surprised everyone and made it himself out of training camp into the Sharks' top 6, and in that first game he managed to get 2 assists for himself in what was a pretty decent all-around game. You know, he wasn't extremely effective in that game getting 2 assists, but he was involved obviously with the 2 assists. However, since then it has been kind of downhill, and especially in the past couple of games, not only has he been basically non-existent in the offensive department, he's been quite the liability defensively. Tonight in particular, just completely awful. You take a look at some of the more advanced stats, and Leonard was not on the ice for a single shot attempt for the Sharks and over 20 shots against for the Avalanche. So not a good night. And of course, he had the disastrous turnover that really started to put the game really out of reach, I guess you could say, which was the one that was the Nishushkin shorthanded goal. This was right after the end of the first period. The Sharks were down 3-1, but certainly not down and out. They had this power play, but then Leonard, terrible giveaway, ends up leading to a goal against, and then 4-1 sort of just piled on into eventually the Sharks lost. So I'm not blaming this entirely on John Leonard, but definitely Bob Booner has been giving a pretty long leash, I would say, so far this season. It's something that we would rarely see with DeBoer. DeBoer was pretty quick to bench rookies if they were not doing well, or at least push them down to the fourth line if they were not doing well. Booner has been a lot more kind with John Leonard, but I think at this point he probably needs to sit out a game or two. I don't know what the option is in the top 6. Probably just move Meyer back up there and you'd have a pretty decent top 6 at that point, especially with how the first line is clicking. But at this point, it's pretty clear that Leonard is not at the moment, maybe after a couple of games off and sort of a reset for him, he's not at the moment playing at really an NHL level. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will have their rematch with the Colorado Avalanche. And as I said, they'll be looking to try and do that split of the little 2-game series here with them. But after having watched how this game ended up going, I don't know how possible that will be. Class dismissed.